The sound of the final shot echoed across the Riverside Police Academy training range as Detective Sarah Chun lowered her service weapon and stared in complete disbelief. Behind her, 43 of the department's finest marksmen stood in stunned silence, watching as the scoring system displayed an impossible result: 47 consecutive bullseyes at distances ranging from 25 to 200 yards. For 18 months, they had called Marcus Thompson lucky shot behind his back. Every perfect score was attributed to beginner's luck. Every competition win was dismissed as a fluke. Every display of technical knowledge was written off as memorized textbook answers from someone who couldn't possibly understand real shooting. Today, Marcus had finally decided to show them exactly how wrong they were. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Thompson had arrived at the Riverside Police Academy on a cold January morning with nothing more than a worn duffel bag and a determination to start over. At 32, he was older than most recruits, a fact that immediately set him apart from the fresh-faced 20-somethings who made up the majority of his training class. His application listed his previous occupation as security consultant, a deliberately vague description that revealed nothing about the 12 years he'd spent as a Navy SEAL sniper. The deliberate obscurity was intentional. After his discharge, following a classified operation that had gone sideways in Yemen, Marcus wanted nothing more than to blend into civilian life. He'd chosen law enforcement because it offered structure and purpose without the constant deployment cycles that had defined his military career. The Riverside Police Department seemed perfect for his needs, large enough to offer anonymity, professional enough to maintain standards, but far removed from the federal agencies that might recognize his specialized background. What Marcus hadn't anticipated was how his decision to downplay his experience would be interpreted by his fellow recruits and instructors. During the initial firearms qualification, he deliberately moderated his performance, scoring well enough to pass without drawing attention. The strategy had backfired spectacularly when his score of 248 out of 250 had been dismissed by instructor Williams as probably the best beginner's luck I've ever seen. The comment had stung more than Marcus cared to admit. During his SEAL career, he'd been known as one of the most precise shooters in naval special warfare. His confirmed kill count in combat zones was classified, but his reputation among elite military units was legendary. To have his abilities dismissed as luck by a civilian instructor felt like a betrayal of everything he'd accomplished in service to his country. The Riverside Police Academy's firearms training program was comprehensive by civilian law enforcement standards, but it felt elementary to someone with Marcus's background. The basic marksmanship principles being taught were concepts he'd mastered 15 years earlier during his initial military training. The tactical shooting scenarios were simplified versions of situations he'd encountered dozens of times in real-world operations. Yet, Marcus forced himself to participate with the enthusiasm of a genuine novice, asking questions he already knew the answers to, and accepting instruction on techniques he could have taught better than the academy staff. The psychological strain of pretending to be less competent than he actually was proved more challenging than any physical training the academy could devise. His fellow recruits had quickly formed their own opinions about Marcus's unexpected shooting ability. Jennifer Rodriguez, a former Marine MP, had initially been curious about his background, noting inconsistencies in his stated experience that didn't match his obvious familiarity with firearms. But when Marcus had deflected her questions with vague answers about private security work, she'd apparently decided he was either lying about his background or had been lucky enough to work for a company that provided excellent training. David Park, a college graduate with a criminal justice degree, had been more direct in his skepticism. During a break between training sessions, He'd loudly proclaimed that Marcus's shooting scores were statistical anomalies that would inevitably regress to more realistic levels as the training became more challenging. His confidence was based on academic theories about performance distribution rather than any practical shooting experience. But his certainty had influenced other recruits who were looking for explanations for Marcus's unexpected competence. Most vocal skeptic was Tommy Sullivan, a former Army military police officer who considered himself the class's resident firearms expert. Sullivan had served 4 years in the Army, including 1 deployment to Iraq, and he seemed to take Marcus's shooting ability as a personal challenge to his own military credibility. His critiques were specific and technical, focusing on Marcus's shooting stance, breathing techniques, and equipment choices with the authority of someone who considered himself qualified to evaluate professional marksmanship. Marcus had endured these assessments with the patience learned during years of military service, but Sullivan's confidence in his own expertise made the situation particularly frustrating. The former MP's shooting scores were respectable by academy standards, but they represented exactly the kind of competent mediocrity that Marcus had once surpassed without conscious effort. Listening to Sullivan critique techniques that Marcus had refined through thousands of hours of specialized training felt like being lectured about aviation by someone who'd never left the ground. The academy's shooting range was located 30 miles outside Riverside, a modern facility with electronic targets and computerized scoring systems that provided immediate feedback on shot placement and grouping size. The range was designed to accommodate everything from basic marksmanship training to advanced tactical scenarios, with distances extending from 7 yards for close quarters combat simulation to 200 yards for precision rifle work. Marcus had quickly realized that the range's capabilities far exceeded what was being utilized in the standard training curriculum. The advanced target systems could simulate moving threats, provide variable lighting conditions, and create complex scenarios that would challenge even experienced shooters. Instead, the academy was using them for static target practice at predetermined distances with standardized ammunition and simplified scoring criteria. The disconnect between the facility's potential and its actual utilization reminded Marcus of the gap between his own capabilities and the role he was playing as a police recruit. Like the range, he was being used far below his design specifications, constrained by an environment that couldn't recognize or utilize his advanced features. During his 3rd week at the academy, Marcus had scored perfect marks on a qualification course that was designed to challenge veteran officers. His groupings had been so tight that Instructor Williams had initially suspected equipment malfunction, requiring Marcus to repeat the course with a different weapon to verify his results. When the second performance matched the first, Williams had simply shrugged and attributed the consistency to some people being natural shots. The explanation had been accepted by most observers, but Marcus had noticed Detective Chun watching him with the kind of analytical attention that suggested professional curiosity rather than casual interest. Chun was a 15-year veteran who served as a liaison between the academy and the department's tactical training unit, and her experience with advanced marksmanship gave her perspective that the academy instructors lacked. After the qualification exercise, Chun had approached Marcus with questions that were more sophisticated than the routine inquiries he'd fielded from other personnel. She'd asked about his grip pressure, sight alignment methodology, and trigger control techniques with the specific terminology of someone who understood precision shooting at a professional level. Marcus had provided technically accurate but deliberately incomplete answers, satisfying her immediate curiosity without revealing the depth of his knowledge. The conversation had ended with Chun making a note in her training file about Marcus's unusual natural ability and recommending him for advanced firearms training once he completed the basic academy curriculum. The recommendation was intended as recognition of his potential, but Marcus had privately worried that advanced training would place him in environments where his true background might be more difficult to conceal. As his time at the academy progressed, Marcus found himself caught between the desire to excel and the need to maintain his carefully constructed anonymity. His shooting scores continued to exceed expectations, but he was careful to introduce enough variability to suggest natural inconsistency rather than controlled performance. The deception required constant mental effort, transforming what should have been relaxing range time into a complex exercise in performance management. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The psychological toll of maintaining this facade had been greater than Marcus had anticipated. During his military career, he'd taken pride in pushing his abilities to their limits, in being recognized as one of the best at what he did. At the academy, he was forced to accept praise for achieving standards that represented a fraction of his actual capability, while listening to critiques from instructors whose expertise was genuine but limited compared to his own specialized training. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that his decision to seek anonymity in civilian law enforcement had placed him in a situation where his most valuable skills were not only unrecognized, but actively dismissed as luck. The very abilities that had made him exceptional as a SEAL were being treated as statistical anomalies by people who couldn't conceive of the training and experience that had developed them. Yet Marcus had persisted with his strategy, convinced that maintaining a low profile was worth the frustration of being underestimated. He'd completed the academy's academic requirements with the same measured competence he'd applied to firearms training, scoring well enough to avoid remedial instruction, while avoiding the kind of standout performance that might prompt deeper investigation into his background. The approach had worked perfectly until the morning, when Detective Chun had announced that the department's annual marksmanship competition would include a demonstration by the academy's most promising recruit. Marcus had realized, with a mixture of dread and anticipation, that his months of careful anonymity were about to come to an end. The first incident happened during week 5 of academy training, when Marcus consistently outscored the entire class on the standardized combat pistol course. The exercise involved engaging multiple targets at varying distances while moving between cover positions, a scenario designed to simulate real-world officer survival situations. While his classmates struggled with the transition from stationary target practice to dynamic shooting, Marcus moved through the course with fluid efficiency that suggested extensive tactical training. His final score of 297 out of 300 was unprecedented in the academy's recent history, but Instructor Williams had simply shaken his head and muttered something about natural athletes before moving on to critique other students' performances. The dismissal was casual, almost reflexive, as if exceptional performance from Marcus had already become expected rather than noteworthy. Jennifer Rodriguez had been standing close enough to hear Williams' comment, and she'd approached Marcus afterward with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "That didn't look like natural talent to me," she'd said, studying his face for tells. "You moved through those positions like you'd done that exact course 100 times before." Marcus had deflected with a modest smile and a comment about video games providing good tactical awareness, an explanation that was both absurd and just plausible enough to avoid further questioning. Rodriguez had looked unconvinced, but she'd dropped the subject when Marcus had changed the conversation to her own performance on the course. The second major incident occurred during a stress fire exercise designed to test accuracy under pressure. The drill required students to engage targets while enduring physical and psychological stressors, loud noises, strobe lights, simulated radio chatter, and physical exertion that elevated heart rates and degraded fine motor control. Most recruits experienced significant degradation in their shooting accuracy, which was both expected and pedagogically useful for demonstrating the importance of stress management in tactical situations. Marcus had actually found the artificial Stressors somewhat amusing compared to the real-world pressures he'd faced during combat operations. Strobe lights and loud music were mild distractions compared to incoming artillery fire and the knowledge that a missed shot could result in the death of team members. His accuracy during the stress fire exercise had remained virtually unchanged. From his performance under ideal conditions, a result that should have prompted serious questions about his background and training. Instead, Instructor Peterson had attributed Marcus's consistency to some people just being naturally cool under pressure. The explanation had been delivered with the tone of someone discussing an interesting but ultimately unremarkable personality trait, as if maintaining precision shooting under artificial stress was comparable to having good hand-eye coordination, or being naturally left-handed. David Park had been more direct in his reaction to Marcus's stress fire performance. During the post-exercise debrief, he'd loudly proclaimed that Marcus's results were statistically impossible for someone without extensive tactical training. His analysis was academically sound, but delivered with the arrogance of someone who believed that theoretical knowledge was superior to practical experience. "Look at the data," Park had said, waving his score sheet for emphasis. Average performance degradation under stress conditions is between 30 and 40% for novice shooters. Marcus improved by 2%. That doesn't happen unless you've been specifically trained for stress management, or you're artificially enhancing your baseline performance. The accusation of performance enhancement had hung in the air for a moment before other students had laughed it off as academic overthinking. Marcus had remained silent during the exchange, neither defending himself nor acknowledging Park's analysis, but he'd filed away the information that at least one person was paying close attention to the patterns in his performance. Tommy Sullivan had taken a different approach to explaining Marcus's continued success. As the class's self-appointed firearms expert, Sullivan had developed increasingly elaborate theories about why Marcus's scores were misleading indicators of actual shooting ability. According to Sullivan, Marcus was benefiting from superior equipment, favorable lane assignments, optimal lighting conditions, and a variety of other factors that created artificial advantages. Give him a different weapon or change the range conditions and you'll see his real skill level, Sullivan had declared during a break between training sessions. His confidence was absolute, backed by his military experience and his own respectable shooting scores. "I've seen this before in the Army. Some guys get lucky with their gear setup and think they're sharpshooters. Reality always catches up eventually." Sullivan's theories had gained traction among several classmates who were struggling with their own shooting performance and welcomed explanations that didn't require them to acknowledge superior ability in a peer. The equipment theory was particularly popular because it suggested that Marcus's success was purchasable rather than earned, reducing the psychological threat to their own self-image as competent shooters. The irony was that Marcus was indeed using superior equipment, but not in the way Sullivan imagined. His service weapon was a standard-issue Glock 22 identical to those used by his classmates. But Marcus had spent hours fine-tuning his grip, stance, and sight picture to optimize performance with that specific firearm. The adjustments were subtle, but significant, representing the kind of weapon familiarization that professional operators took for granted, but civilian shooters rarely achieved. More importantly, Marcus's ammunition selection reflected knowledge that exceeded typical law enforcement training. While his classmates used whatever rounds were provided by the academy, Marcus had quietly identified the most consistent cartridges from each production lot, selecting ammunition based on weight variations and powder charges that affected ballistic performance. The practice was standard procedure for military snipers, but unknown to most civilian shooters. The equipment advantage was real, but it represented expertise rather than luck. Marcus's ability to optimize his setup demonstrated the kind of attention to detail that separated professional marksmen from recreational shooters. Yet his classmates interpreted his consistency as evidence of unfair Advantages rather than superior knowledge and preparation. Detective Chun had been observing these dynamics with growing interest, noting not just Marcus's performance, but the reactions of his classmates and instructors. During a private conversation with Chief Instructor Williams, she'd raised questions about Marcus's background that went beyond casual curiosity. His shooting fundamentals are too refined for someone who learned on the job, Chun had pointed out. The way he handles his weapon, his breathing control, even his post-shot analysis indicates formal training at a level we don't typically see in recruits. Williams had acknowledged Chun's observations but seemed reluctant to investigate further. His application materials check out, and he's meeting all our requirements, Williams had replied. Maybe he's just one of those natural talents who picked up good habits from the beginning. The conversation had revealed an institutional bias toward accepting simple explanations rather than pursuing complex questions about recruit backgrounds. The academy processed hundreds of students each year, and instructors had learned to focus on current performance rather than investigating the origins of particular abilities. Marcus's success was being treated as a pleasant anomaly rather than a puzzle requiring investigation. This pattern of dismissal extended beyond shooting performance to other areas of tactical training. During scenario-based exercises involving building searches, hostage situations, and high-risk arrests, Marcus demonstrated decision-making skills and tactical awareness that exceeded what was expected of police recruits. His movement patterns were economical and purposeful. His threat assessment was rapid and accurate, and his communication during team exercises reflected understanding of advanced tactical principles. Each demonstration of superior capability was explained away by instructors and classmates, who seemed incapable of recognizing the systematic nature of Marcus's expertise. His building search techniques were attributed to good instincts. His threat assessment abilities were explained as street smarts. His tactical communication was dismissed as natural leadership ability. The cumulative effect of these dismissals was psychologically exhausting for Marcus, who found himself caught between pride in his abilities and frustration at their lack of recognition. During his military career, excellence had been acknowledged and rewarded, creating positive feedback loops that motivated continued improvement. At the academy, excellence was either ignored or attributed to factors beyond his control, creating a cognitive dissonance that affected his motivation and satisfaction with the training program. The social dynamics among his classmates had also been complicated by the pattern of dismissal surrounding Marcus's performance. While some recruits genuinely admired his abilities, others seemed threatened by achievements they couldn't explain or replicate. The result was a subtle form of isolation, with Marcus increasingly excluded from informal study groups and social activities where his presence might highlight other students' relative weaknesses. Jennifer Rodriguez had been one of the few classmates who seemed genuinely interested in learning from Marcus rather than explaining away his success. During range sessions, she'd positioned herself to observe his shooting techniques, noting details about his stance, grip, and breathing that she could incorporate into her own practice. Her approach was professional and respectful, acknowledging his superior ability while seeking to benefit from his expertise. "I know you're not telling us everything about your background," Rodriguez had said during one particularly honest conversation. "And I respect that everyone has their reasons for privacy. But if you're willing to share any tips that might help the rest of us improve, I'd appreciate the guidance." Marcus had been touched by Rodriguez's straightforward approach, and he'd begun offering subtle suggestions about shooting fundamentals that could help her without revealing the depth of his own knowledge. The mentoring relationship had been satisfying for both parties, but it had also highlighted how different the training environment could have been if Marcus's expertise had been recognized and utilized properly. The pattern of dismissal had reached its most frustrating point during a firearms instructor certification workshop that Marcus had attended as an observer. The session was led by a civilian contractor who specialized in law enforcement training and his credentials were impressive by police academy standards. However, Marcus had immediately recognized several fundamental errors in the instructor's methodology, techniques that would have been corrected in any military training environment when the instructor had demonstrated what he called advanced shooting stances. Marcus had observed grip inconsistencies and weight distribution problems that would degrade accuracy under stress. The breathing control techniques being taught were oversimplified versions of methods that Marcus had learned during his first month of SEAL training. Most significantly, the ballistics information being presented contained factual errors that could affect officer safety in real-world situations. Marcus had faced a moral dilemma about whether to correct misinformation that could potentially endanger his classmates. His solution had been to raise his hand and ask seemingly innocent questions that allowed the instructor to discover and correct his own errors without direct challenge to his authority. The approach had been diplomatically successful, but it had required Marcus to disguise his expertise as curiosity, further reinforcing the pattern of concealment that defined his academy experience. The psychological strain of maintaining this deception had begun affecting Marcus's sleep and overall well-being. He'd entered law enforcement seeking a fresh start and a chance to serve his community, but the academy environment had created unexpected challenges that had nothing to do with the actual demands of police work. The constant need to moderate his performance and accept dismissive explanations for his abilities was wearing down his enthusiasm for the career change he'd hoped would provide fulfillment and purpose. As Marcus approached the midpoint of his academy training, he'd begun questioning whether his decision to hide his military background had been wise. The strategy had successfully preserved his anonymity, but it had also prevented him from building the kind of professional relationships that made challenging training bearable and rewarding. More concerning was his growing realization that the pattern of dismissal was likely to continue into his actual police career, where his abilities would continue to be misunderstood and underutilized. The breaking point was approaching, though Marcus didn't yet realize it. The accumulated frustration of months spent accepting explanations of luck and natural talent was building pressure that would soon demand release. All it would take was the right catalyst to transform Marcus from a student who hid his abilities into a professional who was ready to demonstrate exactly what 18 months of patient endurance had concealed. The first crack in Marcus's carefully maintained facade appeared during week 12, when a new instructor arrived at the academy with credentials that made everyone take notice. Captain Rebecca Hayes was a former FBI hostage rescue team operator, recently retired after 20 years of federal service. Her resume included counterterrorism operations, precision rifle instruction at Quantico, and advanced tactical training that exceeded anything previously available at the Riverside Police Academy. Hayes had been brought in specifically to elevate the Academy's firearms program, introducing training methodologies that reflected current best practices in law enforcement and military circles. Her arrival represented both an opportunity and a threat to Marcus's strategy of concealment, as her experience would enable her to recognize advanced skills that civilian instructors had overlooked or misinterpreted. During her first week at the academy, Hayes observed existing training protocols with the analytical eye of someone who had spent 2 decades evaluating tactical performance at the highest levels. Her assessments were thorough and uncompromising, identifying weaknesses in current methodology while recognizing individual students who showed potential for advanced training. Marcus had immediately understood that Hayes represented a different category of instructor than those he'd encountered previously. Her movement patterns, weapon handling, and instructional terminology reflected the kind of professional competence that came from operational experience rather than academic study. When she demonstrated shooting techniques during her initial presentation, Marcus recognized methods and principles that were consistent with his own SEAL training. The recognition was mutual. During her second day of observation, Hayes had positioned herself directly behind Marcus during a standard qualification course, watching his performance with the focused attention of someone who understood the difference between natural talent and professional training. Her questions afterward had been specific and probing, delivered with the casual authority of someone who expected honest answers. "Where did you learn to control your breathing like that?" Hayes had asked, her tone conversational, but her eyes sharp. "That's not a technique we typically see from recruits, even those with prior shooting experience." Marcus had provided his standard deflection about private security training, but Hayes's expression had suggested skepticism rather than acceptance. Unlike previous instructors, she hadn't moved on to other topics when his explanation proved vague. Instead, she'd made a note in her training folder and indicated that she wanted to observe his performance more closely during future exercises. The heightened scrutiny from Hayes coincided with increased social pressure from his classmates who were beginning to view Marcus's continued success as a challenge to their own competence and standing within the academy hierarchy. David Park had become particularly vocal about what he termed performance inconsistencies in academy scoring, using Marcus as his primary example of systemic problems with evaluation methodology. "Statistical analysis doesn't lie," Park had proclaimed during a heated discussion in the academy dining hall. "Nobody maintains that level of consistency without either extensive prior training or some form of artificial enhancement. The academy needs to investigate anomalous performance patterns before they compromise the integrity of our certification process." Park's academic approach to the question had lent credibility to suspicions that other students harbored but hadn't articulated as systematically. His charts and graphs showing Marcus's performance compared to class averages created a visual representation of the gap that many had observed but few had quantified. The data was compelling enough to generate informal discussions among students about whether academy testing procedures were adequate to detect various forms of cheating. Tommy Sullivan had taken a more direct approach, challenging Marcus to demonstrate his abilities under conditions that would eliminate what Sullivan considered artificial advantages. During an unsupervised range session, Sullivan had proposed a shooting competition using identical weapons, ammunition, and target distances, with neutral observers to ensure fairness. "If you're really as good as your scores suggest, then you shouldn't have any problem proving it under controlled conditions," Sullivan had said, his tone carrying the confidence of someone who believed he was calling a bluff. "I'm willing to put my reputation on the line. The question is whether you're willing to do the same." The challenge had been issued publicly, with several classmates present to witness Marcus's response. Declining would have been interpreted as admission that his previous success had indeed been due to favorable conditions rather than genuine ability. Accepting would require Marcus to demonstrate his skills under scrutiny that might reveal more about his background than he was prepared to discuss. Marcus had agreed to the competition, calculating that a carefully modulated performance could satisfy Sullivan's challenge without exposing his true capabilities. The decision represented a departure from his previous strategy of avoiding situations that might draw additional attention. But the social pressure had reached a point where some form of demonstration seemed inevitable. The informal competition had been scheduled for the following weekend, giving both participants time to prepare and allowing word to spread throughout the academy. What had begun as a private challenge between two students had evolved into a public test of Marcus's legitimacy as a shooter, with implications that extended beyond simple bragging rights. Captain Hayes had learned about the competition through unofficial channels and had requested permission to observe, ostensibly to evaluate both students' performance for potential advanced training opportunities. Her presence would add an additional layer of scrutiny that Marcus had not anticipated, as her professional expertise would enable her to assess not just accuracy, but technique, tactics, and overall competence. The psychological pressure of the impending competition had begun affecting Marcus's daily routine and mental state. For months, he had successfully managed the stress of concealing his abilities through careful performance, management, and strategic deflection. The prospect of a public demonstration under professional observation represented a qualitatively different challenge that tested his ability to maintain his carefully constructed anonymity. During this period, Marcus had also been dealing with personal pressures that complicated his academy experience. His mother had been diagnosed with early-stage cancer, requiring regular medical appointments that conflicted with his training schedule. The academy had been accommodating about absences for family medical emergencies, but the emotional stress of his mother's illness had added another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation. His relationship with Sarah Martinez, a local nurse he'd been dating since arriving in Riverside, had also reached a critical juncture. Sarah had been patient with Marcus's reluctance to discuss his military background, but her own family's history of service had made her increasingly curious about the experiences he seemed determined to keep private. "I understand that some military experiences are difficult to talk about," Sarah had said during a particularly honest conversation. "But I feel like I'm dating someone who's only showing me half of who he really is. That's not sustainable for either of us." The conversation had forced Marcus to confront the broader implications of his decision to conceal his background. The strategy that had begun as a simple desire for anonymity in his professional life was affecting his personal relationships and creating barriers to the genuine connections he'd hoped to build in civilian life. Jennifer Rodriguez had also become more direct in her observations about Marcus's performance and background. During a night firearms training exercise that simulated low-light law enforcement scenarios, Marcus had demonstrated night vision adaptation and target acquisition skills that exceeded what any civilian training could provide. "I was a Marine MP for 4 years," Rodriguez had said afterward, studying Marcus's face in the range's artificial lighting. "I worked with special operations units often enough to recognize certain skills when I saw them. Whatever your real background is, it's not private security consulting." Her assessment had been delivered without accusation or judgment, but with the professional recognition of someone who understood military training hierarchies. Rodriguez wasn't seeking to expose Marcus or challenge his cover story, but her acknowledgement of his true capabilities created another crack in the facade he'd worked so hard to maintain. The mounting pressure had also manifested in physical symptoms that Marcus recognized from his military experience with high-stress operations. His sleep patterns had become irregular, interrupted by dreams that mixed academy scenarios with combat memories from his SEAL deployments. His appetite had decreased, and he'd noticed muscle tension that suggested his body was preparing for conflict, even when his conscious mind was focused on routine training activities. Most concerning was his growing difficulty in moderating his performance during routine exercises. The psychological effort required to consistently perform below his actual capabilities was becoming harder to maintain, particularly when fatigue or stress compromised his self-control. During a recent tactical scenario, Marcus had briefly reverted to movement patterns that reflected his special operations training, earning surprised comments from observers who recognized the sudden change in his competence level. Captain Hayes had been present during that exercise, and her subsequent questions had been more pointed than previous inquiries. She'd asked about specific tactical training schools and instructor certifications, probing for details that would either confirm or contradict Marcus's stated background. Her approach was professional but persistent, suggesting that she had developed her own theories about his real qualifications. The institutional pressure was also intensifying as Marcus approached graduation from the academy. Career counseling sessions had begun, with administrators discussing potential assignments and specializations based on demonstrated aptitudes and interests. Marcus's shooting scores and tactical performance had already generated interest from the department's SWAT team and detective divisions, creating opportunities that would place him in environments where his true capabilities might be harder To conceal, Detective Chun had specifically requested a meeting to discuss Marcus's potential for assignment to the department's precision rifle program, which provided sniper support for high-risk operations. The conversation would require Marcus to either decline an opportunity that perfectly matched his actual qualifications or accept a position that would inevitably expose his military background to professional colleagues. The breaking point was approaching with mathematical inevitability. Marcus could feel the convergence of pressures that would soon make his current strategy untenable. The upcoming competition with Sullivan would test his ability to demonstrate competence without revealing expertise. Captain Hayes's continued scrutiny threatened to expose inconsistencies in his cover story. His classmates' growing suspicions were creating social tensions that affected both his training experience and his preparation for graduation. Most significantly, Marcus was beginning to question whether his desire for anonymity was worth the psychological and professional costs he was paying to maintain it. The skills and experience that had defined his identity as a SEAL were being suppressed in favor of a false persona that served no one's interests and prevented him from contributing his actual capabilities to law enforcement training and operations. As he prepared for the weekend competition that would either validate or destroy his carefully maintained reputation as a lucky shooter, Marcus faced a decision that would determine not just his immediate future at the academy, but his entire approach to building a new life in civilian law enforcement. The months of patience and concealment had brought him to a crossroads where maintaining his anonymity might no longer be possible or desirable. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test more than just Marcus's shooting ability. It would determine whether he could continue living as someone he wasn't, or whether the time had come to reveal exactly who he had always been. The emergency alert pierced through the Saturday morning comm at exactly 9:42 a.m., shattering what should have been a routine weekend at the Riverside Police Academy. Marcus was in the armory preparing for his scheduled competition with Tommy Sullivan when the piercing wail of the emergency notification system echoed across the facility, followed immediately by the urgent voice of dispatch control. Code Red Emergency. Active shooter situation at Westfield Shopping Mall. Multiple casualties reported. All available Academy personnel and local units respond immediately to the staging area. This is not a drill. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, instantly triggering muscle memory and tactical awareness that had been dormant for months. His hands automatically secured his equipment while his mind began processing the tactical implications of an active shooter scenario in a crowded commercial environment. The mall was located only 12 minutes from the academy, placing them among the closest law enforcement assets to the crisis. Captain Hayes burst into the armory, her professional composure barely containing the urgency of the situation. All Academy personnel are responding as auxiliary support, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to crisis management. This is a real-world application of your training. Gear up and report to the staging area immediately. The transformation in the Academy's atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Students who had been preparing for weekend training exercises suddenly found themselves facing the possibility of actual combat against an armed adversary. The theoretical scenarios they'd practiced during academy training were about to become life-or-death realities that would test every aspect of their preparation and courage. Marcus moved with practiced efficiency, securing his duty weapon and tactical gear while his mind automatically began calculating response times, probable tactical requirements, and optimal equipment configurations for an urban combat environment. The familiar adrenaline surge of pre-combat preparation was both comforting and concerning, as it revealed how easily he could slip back into his military mindset. Despite months of civilian law enforcement training, Tommy Sullivan appeared beside him, his earlier confidence about their scheduled competition completely forgotten in the face of genuine crisis. "Jesus, Marcus," Sullivan said, his voice tight with tension. This is really happening. We might actually have to use everything we've learned here. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that he and Sullivan were preparing to respond to a situation where Marcus's concealed SEAL training would be far more relevant than anything they'd learned during academy instruction. Urban combat against active shooters was exactly the kind of scenario that had defined much of his military career. While it represented unknown territory for most of his classmates. At the staging area, chaos was controlled but evident as multiple law enforcement agencies coordinated their response to an unprecedented crisis. Riverside Police Department patrol units were already on scene, establishing perimeter security, while SWAT teams from neighboring jurisdictions were en route, but still 20 minutes away. The first officers on scene had reported at least 4 confirmed casualties and an unknown number of hostages trapped inside the mall's main concourse. Chief Inspector Williams was coordinating academy personnel assignments, his usual classroom authority replaced by the grim efficiency of someone managing a real crisis. Academy students will be assigned to perimeter security and crowd control, he announced to the assembled group. You are not authorized for building entry or direct engagement unless specifically ordered by on-scene commanders. Marcus understood the logic behind limiting academy students to support roles, but he also recognized that the developing tactical situation might require capabilities that exceeded what was available from current on-scene personnel. The initial reports suggested a well-armed adversary who had chosen a complex environment that would challenge even experienced tactical teams. Detective Shun approached Marcus with a tablet containing preliminary intelligence about the situation. The shooter appears to be using a high-powered rifle and has positioned himself on the second floor near the food court, she reported, her voice professional but tense. He has clear sight lines to multiple entry points and is already engaged. Responding officers. SWAT teams are still en route, but we need immediate intelligence about his position and capabilities. The tactical problem was becoming clear to Marcus even as Chun described it. The mall's architecture created significant advantages for a prepared shooter who understood how to use elevation and concealment to dominate approach routes. Without proper reconnaissance and coordinated tactical response, any attempt to neutralize the threat would likely result in additional casualties among both civilians and law enforcement personnel. Captain Hayes had been monitoring radio communications from the on-scene incident commander, and her expression suggested growing concern about the developing situation. The shooter appears to have military training, she reported to the assembled academy personnel. His positioning is tactical, and he's demonstrating knowledge of police response procedures. This isn't a random act of violence, it's a planned assault. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he processed this intelligence. A trained adversary in a prepared position represented exactly the kind of threat that required specialized tactical response. The standard police procedures being implemented were appropriate for containing typical active shooter situations, but they might be inadequate against someone with military knowledge and advanced preparation. Jennifer Rodriguez moved closer to Marcus, her expression reflecting both fear and determination. Marcus, I know you've been downplaying your background, but if you have experience that could help in this situation, now might be the time to speak up. Her words carried weight beyond their literal meaning. Rodriguez was essentially challenging Marcus to abandon his carefully maintained anonymity in favor of contributing his actual capabilities to a crisis where lives hung in the balance. The decision she was asking him to make would irrevocably alter his situation at the academy and potentially expose him to scrutiny he'd been avoiding for months. Before Marcus could respond, the radio crackled with an urgent transmission from the incident commander on scene. We have civilians trapped in the northwest wing with no available exit routes. The shooter is preventing evacuation through the main corridors, and we don't have assets in position to provide covering fire for civilian movement. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Trapped civilians represented both a humanitarian crisis and a tactical complication that would prevent the use of many standard law enforcement responses. Without the ability to clear innocent bystanders from the danger area, any tactical operation would risk collateral casualties that could exceed the damage caused by the original shooter. Captain Hayes was consulting with Chief Williams about the Academy's potential contribution to the developing operation. Their conversation was too quiet for Marcus to overhear, but their body language suggested disagreement about how best to utilize available personnel. Hayes's military background was clearly informing her assessment of the tactical requirements, while Williams appeared focused on protecting the Academy students from exposure to excessive risk. Marcus's internal conflict reached a breaking point as he listened to radio reports describing the increasing danger to trapped civilians. His SEAL training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation, and his conscience wouldn't allow him to remain passive while people died, and he possessed capabilities that could save lives. The months of concealment and careful anonymity suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the immediate need for his specialized skills. Detective Chen approached him again, this time with a direct question that cut through his uncertainty. "Marcus, I've been watching your performance for months, and I know you have capabilities that exceed what's in your personnel file. The incident commander is asking for anyone with advanced tactical training or sniper experience. Do you have anything to contribute?" The moment of decision had arrived with stark clarity. Marcus could continue maintaining his cover story and accept assignment to perimeter security, or he could reveal his true background and volunteer for a role that matched his actual qualifications. The choice would determine not just his response to the current crisis, but his entire future relationship with law enforcement and his classmates. Marcus looked toward the mall, visible in the distance beyond the staging area vehicles and emergency personnel. Somewhere inside that building, innocent people were trapped and dying while he possessed skills that could potentially save them. The weight of that responsibility was greater than any concern about maintaining his anonymity or avoiding questions about his background. "Detective Chen," Marcus said, his voice carrying a calm authority that hadn't been present during his months as a student. "I'm a former Navy SEAL with specialized training in urban combat and precision shooting. I can provide tactical reconnaissance and sniper support if the incident commander needs those capabilities." Chun's reaction was immediate and intense, her eyes widening as the implications of Marcus's revelation became clear. "Navy SEAL?" she repeated, studying his face for confirmation. "What's your background? How extensive is your training?" Marcus understood that his next words would end months of careful concealment and transform him from an academy student into a recognized expert, whose capabilities would be scrutinized and utilized. 12 years active duty, including multiple deployments in urban combat environments. "I'm qualified as a precision marksman at ranges up to 1,200 meters and trained in close-quarters battle, reconnaissance, and tactical coordination." The information hit Chun like a revelation that explained months of questions about Marcus's performance and background. Her expression shifted from surprise to professional assessment as she began calculating how his revealed capabilities could be integrated into the current tactical response. Captain Hayes, who had been monitoring their conversation, approached with the focused intensity of someone who recognized the significance of what she'd just heard. "Thompson, if what you're telling us is accurate, you represent capabilities that could be crucial for resolving this situation. Are you willing to volunteer for immediate tactical deployment?" Marcus met her gaze directly, knowing that his answer would irrevocably alter his carefully planned transition to civilian law enforcement. "Yes, ma'am. I'm ready to provide whatever support the incident commander requires." Hayes nodded and immediately began coordinating with the on-scene tactical commanders, relaying information about Marcus's background and capabilities. The conversation was brief but intense, with Hayes providing assurances about Marcus's qualifications, while requesting authorization for his immediate deployment in a support role. The response from the incident commander was swift and grateful. "Send him immediately. We need someone who can provide overwatch and tactical intelligence, while our SWAT teams position for building entry. Time is critical. We're losing civilians while we wait for additional assets." As Marcus prepared for immediate deployment to the crisis scene, he felt the familiar mental transition that occurred when he shifted from civilian mindset to tactical operator. His months of academy training and careful concealment were ending, replaced by the professional identity that had defined his military career and would now shape his response to the most serious crisis Riverside had ever faced: the competition. With Tommy Sullivan was forgotten, relegated to insignificance by real-world events that demanded everything Marcus had learned during 12 years of military service. The moment had arrived for him to demonstrate not just his shooting ability, but his capacity to function as a professional operator in a life-or-death situation where his concealed skills might be the difference between civilian casualties and successful tactical resolution. As the emergency vehicles raced toward Westfield Mall, Marcus felt both relief and apprehension about the revelation that would transform his academy experience and his future in law enforcement. The careful anonymity he'd maintained for 18 months was ending, but it was being replaced by an opportunity to serve his community using the full extent of his training and capabilities. Marcus arrived at the Westfield Mall perimeter with Captain Hayes and Detective Chun, the familiar weight of tactical gear replacing the uncertain burden of concealment he'd carried for 18 months. The transformation in how his colleagues treated him was immediate and profound. Where academy students typically received basic assignments and constant supervision, Marcus found himself briefed directly by Incident Commander Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, a 25-year veteran who understood the value of experienced operators in crisis situations. "Thompson, your timing couldn't be better," Morrison said, spreading tactical maps across the hood of a command vehicle. "We have a shooter with elevated position and military training, who's effectively trapped 60-plus civilians in the Northwest Wing. Our SWAT teams are staging for entry, but we need intelligence on his exact position and movement patterns before we can proceed safely." The briefing revealed a tactical situation that was both complex and dangerous. The shooter had positioned himself on the second floor near the food court, using overturned tables and structural pillars to create a defensive position that dominated multiple approach routes. His weapon appeared to be a modified R-15 with enhanced optics, and his shooting discipline suggested formal training rather than amateur preparation. Marcus studied the architectural plans with the analytical approach he'd developed during years of mission planning. The mall's design created natural choke points that favored a defender, while the presence of civilians complicated any tactical response that involved direct assault. What the situation required was precise intelligence about the shooter's position and capabilities, information that could only be gathered by someone with advanced reconnaissance training. "Sir, I can provide overwatch and intelligence gathering if you can get me to an elevated position with clear sightlines into the target area," Marcus offered, his voice carrying the professional confidence that had been absent during his months as an academy student. "I'll need a precision rifle and communication equipment to coordinate with your assault teams." Morrison's response was immediate approval, but it came with conditions that reflected the high-stakes nature of the operation. "You'll be working directly with our tactical coordinator, Sergeant Williams, and your intelligence reports will be feeding directly into our assault planning. Any mistakes in your observations could result in civilian casualties or officer deaths." The weight of that responsibility was familiar to Marcus from his military deployments, but it felt different in a civilian law enforcement context, where the rules of engagement were more restrictive and the political consequences of failure were more severe. During his SEAL career, tactical mistakes had resulted in mission failure and potential strategic setbacks. Here, Any errors could result in the deaths of innocent shoppers whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Marcus was equipped with a department precision rifle, a Remington 700 that was similar enough to weapons he'd used during military service to feel familiar, despite minor differences in configuration. The scope was high-quality civilian equipment rather than military-grade optics, but it would be adequate for the ranges and precision required for intelligence gathering in an urban environment. His insertion point was the roof of a parking structure that provided an elevated view into the mall's main concourse. The position offered excellent observation capabilities while maintaining sufficient distance to avoid detection by the shooter. As Marcus established his firing position, he felt the familiar mental transition that occurred when he shifted from observer to operator, his awareness narrowing to focus entirely on the tactical environment. Through his scope, Marcus could immediately see details that hadn't been visible to ground-level observers. The shooter's position was more sophisticated than initial reports had suggested, with improvised barriers that provided protection from multiple angles while maintaining clear fields of fire toward potential approach routes. His movement patterns were disciplined and tactical, suggesting military training that exceeded basic infantry instruction. More concerning was Marcus's observation that the shooter appeared to be conserving ammunition and selecting targets based on tactical considerations, rather than random violence. His shots were precise and deliberate, aimed at preventing law enforcement movement rather than maximizing civilian casualties. The pattern suggested someone with a specific operational objective beyond simple mass violence. Overwatch to command. Marcus reported through his radio, using the professional terminology that identified his role in the tactical operation. Target appears to be implementing area denial tactics rather than conducting random shooting. His position is heavily fortified, and he's demonstrating fire discipline consistent with advanced military training. The intelligence Marcus provided immediately changed the tactical assessment of the situation. Instead of responding to a typical active shooter scenario, law enforcement was facing what appeared to be a prepared adversary with specific tactical objectives. The distinction was crucial for planning appropriate response strategies and allocating resources effectively. Through his scope, Marcus could also observe the civilian situation in greater detail than had been possible from ground level. Approximately 40 people were trapped in the northwest wing, including families with children who were hiding behind overturned retail displays and in store security areas. Their positions were partially concealed from the shooter, but any attempt to evacuate would require them to cross open areas, where they would be exposed to rifle fire. Marcus's radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Sergeant Williams, the tactical coordinator who was planning the assault operation. Overwatch, we need to know if you can provide precision fire support during civilian evacuation. Our SWAT teams can create a distraction, but we need someone who can suppress the shooter if he engages fleeing civilians. The request represented exactly the kind of responsibility that Marcus had been trained for during his SEAL career, but it also carried legal and ethical implications that were different in a civilian law enforcement context. Any shots fired would be subject to intensive scrutiny, and the rules of engagement were more restrictive than those he'd operated under during military deployments. Affirmative, Marcus responded, settling into his shooting position with movements that reflected thousands of hours of training. I have clear observation of the target area and can provide precision fire support. Range to target is approximately 280 meters with favorable wind conditions. As Marcus prepared for potential engagement, his mind automatically calculated the ballistic solution while assessing the tactical requirements for protecting fleeing civilians. The shot angles were challenging but manageable, and his position provided sufficient concealment to prevent immediate counterfire from the shooter's location. The evacuation began with SWAT teams creating diversions at multiple entry points, while civilian families began moving towards secured exit routes. Marcus tracked the shooter through his scope, noting that the adversary was responding to the tactical situation with discipline and intelligence that confirmed advanced training. His movement patterns were economical and purposeful, suggesting someone who understood how to conserve energy and maintain tactical advantage during extended operations. When the shooter shifted position to engage fleeing civilians, Marcus was ready. His first shot was fired with the precision that had made him legendary during his military career, the bullet striking the shooter's rifle and rendering it inoperable without causing fatal injury. The impact was perfectly placed to neutralize the threat while avoiding lethal force that might not have been legally justified. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Deprived of his primary weapon, the shooter's tactical advantage evaporated, allowing SWAT teams to advance while civilians completed their evacuation. Marcus's second shot, fired moments later when the shooter produced a secondary weapon, struck the adversary's shooting hand with surgical precision that demonstrated capabilities far beyond typical law enforcement training. Target neutralized, Marcus reported, watching through his scope as SWAT officers secured the wounded shooter and began medical treatment. All civilians appear to be clear of the danger air. No fatal casualties were observed. The successful resolution of the crisis had been achieved through a combination of tactical coordination and precision shooting that showcased Marcus's true capabilities to an audience of law enforcement professionals who finally understood what they'd been witnessing during his months at the academy. The lucky shots that had characterized his training performance were revealed as controlled demonstrations of skills that had been developed through years of specialized military training. Captain Hayes was among the first to reach Marcus's position after the all-clear was announced, her expression showing a mixture of professional admiration and personal amazement. "Thompson, I've worked with military snipers throughout my FBI career, and I've never seen shooting like what you just demonstrated. Those were surgical precision shots under pressure that would challenge the best operators I've known." The praise was gratifying, but Marcus was more focused on the successful outcome than personal recognition. "Ma'am, we achieved the primary objective with no civilian casualties. That's what matters most." Detective Chun joined the conversation, with a tablet in hand, documenting the tactical operation for official reports that would be scrutinized by multiple agencies and review boards. "Marcus, your precision shooting and tactical intelligence were instrumental in resolving this situation. The shooter was neutralized with minimal force, and 43 civilians were safely evacuated because of your support." Word of Marcus's performance spread rapidly through the law enforcement community that had responded to the crisis. Officers who had initially been curious about the academy student providing sniper support were now seeking opportunities to meet the operator whose capabilities had proven decisive in preventing a mass casualty event. Tommy Sullivan was among the first academy students to approach Marcus after the operation concluded, his earlier challenges and competition proposals forgotten in light of what he'd witnessed. "Jesus, Marcus," Sullivan said, shaking his head in amazement. "I thought I understood shooting until I watched you work today. Where did you learn to do things like that?" The question that Sullivan was asking reflected the broader curiosity of everyone who had observed Marcus's performance during the crisis. His carefully maintained anonymity was permanently ended, replaced by recognition as someone whose capabilities exceeded anything typically available in civilian law enforcement. The revelation would have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Jennifer Rodriguez approached with the kind of professional respect that Marcus had missed during his months of concealment. "I knew you were holding back at the academy, but I never imagined the extent of your training. Today you saved lives by using skills that most of us can't even comprehend." Her acknowledgement carried particular weight because Rodriguez's own military background enabled her to understand the significance of what Marcus had demonstrated. Unlike civilian observers who might be impressed by the results, Rodriguez could appreciate the technical expertise and training that had made those results possible. Chief Inspector Williams arrived with preliminary reports about the shooters. Background that provided context for the tactical sophistication Marcus had observed. The suspect is a former Army Ranger with combat experience who was apparently planning this attack for months. His position and equipment choices suggest advanced preparation and tactical knowledge that would have challenged any standard law enforcement response. The intelligence confirmed Marcus's assessment that they had been facing a trained adversary rather than a typical active shooter. His ability to recognize and adapt to the tactical situation had been crucial for developing appropriate response strategies and utilizing resources effectively. As the emergency response teams began their post-incident procedures, Marcus found himself at the center of conversations about his background, capabilities, and potential future roles within law enforcement. The transformation from overlooked academy student to recognized expert had been completed in less than 4 hours, fundamentally altering his relationship with colleagues and supervisors, who now understood what they had been observing for 18 months. Captain Hayes approached with official paperwork that would document Marcus's role in the tactical operation, but her expression suggested that administrative requirements were secondary to professional recognition. Thompson, I need you to understand that what you demonstrated today represents capabilities that are extremely rare in civilian law enforcement. There will be opportunities available to you that match your actual qualifications rather than your academy student status. The offer represented exactly the kind of recognition that Marcus had been avoiding for months, but it was being presented in the context of successful service rather than unwanted scrutiny. His revealed capabilities were being valued as assets that could benefit law enforcement operations rather than problems that needed to be explained or managed. As Marcus secured his equipment and prepared for the extensive debriefing that would As Marcus secured his equipment and prepared for the extensive debriefing that would follow any officer-involved shooting, he reflected on how completely the day's events had transformed his situation. The careful anonymity he'd maintained since arriving at the academy was permanently ended, but it had been replaced by professional recognition that acknowledged his true worth as an operator and law enforcement asset. The competition with Tommy Sullivan seemed like ancient history, relegated to insignificance by real-world events that had tested and proven Marcus's capabilities under the most demanding circumstances possible. There would be no more questions about luck or natural talent, no more dismissive explanations for consistent excellence, and no more need to hide abilities that had just been demonstrated to save innocent lives. 3 weeks after the Westfield Mall incident, Marcus Thompson found himself standing before a panel of federal investigators in a secure conference room at the FBI's regional headquarters. The successful resolution of the active shooter crisis had attracted attention from agencies far beyond the Riverside Police Department, and what had begun as a routine after-action review had evolved into something far more significant. Agent Patricia Valdez, the lead investigator from the FBI's Critical Incident Response Group, studied Marcus across the polished conference table with the analytical intensity of someone who had spent 20 years evaluating tactical performance at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Her questions during the preliminary interviews had been precise and probing, designed to separate genuine expertise from exaggerated claims about military experience. Mr. Thompson, Agent Valdez began, consulting a thick folder of documentation. Our investigation into the Westfield incident has raised questions that extend beyond the immediate tactical operation. The shooter, Kevin Morrison, was part of a domestic terrorism cell that has been under federal surveillance for 8 months. His attack was apparently a diversion for a larger operation that we're still investigating. Marcus felt a familiar chill as he processed the implications of this intelligence. The tactical situation he'd helped resolve had been more complex than anyone had initially understood. with ramifications that extended far beyond a single active shooter incident. The precision and discipline he'd observed in Morrison's defensive position suddenly made more sense in the context of coordinated terrorist operations. Agent Valdez continued, her expression grave. Morrison's cell was planning simultaneous attacks on 3 soft targets across the region, designed to overwhelm law enforcement response capabilities and maximize psychological impact. Your intervention at the mall disrupted their timeline and potentially saved hundreds of lives across multiple locations. The revelation transformed Marcus's understanding of his role in the crisis. What he'd viewed as a successful but isolated tactical operation had apparently prevented a coordinated terrorist attack that could have resulted in casualties on a scale that would have traumatized the entire region. The weight of that responsibility was both humbling and concerning, as it suggested that his involvement had been more significant than he'd realized. The reason we're having this conversation, Agent Valdez explained, is that Morrison's cell had access to intelligence about local law enforcement capabilities that should have been classified. They knew about SWAT response times, equipment limitations, and tactical procedures that aren't publicly available. Someone with inside knowledge was feeding them information. Marcus understood immediately where the conversation was heading. His unexpected presence and capabilities at the mall had disrupted plans that were based on intelligence about normal law enforcement response capacity. The terrorists hadn't planned for the presence of someone with advanced military training and precision shooting abilities. Agent Valdez leaned forward, her tone becoming more direct. We need to understand exactly what happened during that operation. And more importantly, we need your help with the continuing investigation. Morrison survived your shots and is currently in federal custody, but he's not talking. His cell members have gone underground, and we believe they're planning to complete their original mission using modified tactics. The request for Marcus's continued involvement represented both an opportunity and a complication. His performance during the mall crisis had demonstrated capabilities that were valuable to federal law enforcement, but accepting such a role would permanently alter his planned transition to civilian police work. More significantly, it would place him in operational environments that might expose him to the same kinds of dangers he'd hoped to leave behind when he'd separated from the SEALs. Special Agent Michael Chun, Agent Valdez's partner, opened another folder containing surveillance photographs and tactical assessments. Thompson, your precision shooting during the mall operation provided us with a unique opportunity. Morrison is paralyzed from your second shot, which struck his spinal cord. He's physically incapacitated, but mentally intact, which means he has information about the terrorist network that we desperately need. Marcus studied the medical reports and tactical photographs, noting details that revealed the exact placement and effects of his shots during the crisis. The documentation was thorough and professional, but it also represented a level of scrutiny that made him uncomfortable. His military training had included extensive instruction about operational security and the dangers of allowing adversaries to study successful tactical methods. What exactly are you asking me to do? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Agent Valdez exchanged glances with her partner before responding. We want you to participate in Morrison's interrogation. Your shots saved his life while neutralizing his capabilities, which has created a psychological dynamic that our behavioral analysts believe could be exploited. He respects your tactical abilities while simultaneously resenting his capture. That combination might make him more willing to provide information. The request was unprecedented in Marcus's experience. During his military career, he'd occasionally provided intelligence gathered during sniper operations, but he'd never been asked to participate directly in interrogating adversaries he'd engaged. The psychological aspects of the proposal were complex and potentially unpredictable, with implications that extended beyond simple information gathering. Agent Chun provided additional context that made the request more urgent. Morrison's cell was planning to target a children's hospital and 2 elementary schools during their next phase of operations. The intelligence we need from Morrison could prevent attacks that would make the mall incident look minor by comparison. The stakes involved transformed Marcus's decision from a professional choice into a moral imperative. His reluctance to become involved in federal operations was insignificant compared to the potential consequences of terrorist attacks against children. The specialized skills that had made him valuable during the mall crisis were apparently needed, again for an operation that could prevent far greater tragedies. "I'll participate," Marcus agreed, "but I need to understand exactly what role you're expecting me to play and what authority I'll have during the interrogation process." Agent Valdez outlined a plan that was both sophisticated and psychologically complex. Marcus would be introduced to Morrison as a consultant rather than an active law enforcement officer, creating ambiguity about his official status that might encourage the prisoner to view him as a potential ally rather than an adversary. The strategy relied on Morrison's respect for Marcus's tactical abilities and his possible resentment toward the federal agents who were holding him. The interrogation was scheduled for the following morning at a secure federal facility that specialized in high-value prisoner management. Marcus spent the intervening hours reviewing intelligence files about Morrison's background, terrorist cell structure, and the specific threats that federal agencies were trying to prevent. The preparation reminded him of mission briefings during his SEAL career, but the objectives were focused on information gathering rather than direct action. Morrison was confined in a medical facility that reflected both his prisoner status and his physical condition. The spinal injury from Marcus's precision shot had left him paralyzed from the chest down, requiring specialized medical equipment and constant supervision. Despite his physical limitations, Morrison's intelligence and tactical knowledge made him one of the most dangerous prisoners in federal custody. The initial meeting between Marcus and Morrison was electric with tension and mutual recognition. Morrison's eyes immediately focused on Marcus with the intensity of someone who understood exactly who was responsible for his current condition. His first words revealed both respect and resentment for the tactical skills that had ended his operational career. "The sniper from the mall," Morrison said, his voice carrying a mixture of professional admiration and personal hatred. "I have to admit, those were impressive shots. Surgical precision under pressure. Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Marcus had been coached by federal psychologists about how to respond to Morrison's questions and attempts to establish rapport. His answers were designed to encourage conversation while avoiding the revelation of specific details about his military background that might compromise operational security. "Military training," Marcus replied simply. "Though I'm more interested in your background. You demonstrated tactical knowledge during the mall operation that exceeded typical civilian capabilities." The conversation continued for over 3 hours, with Morrison gradually revealing details about his terrorist cell's structure, recruitment methods, and operational planning. The information was extracted through careful psychological manipulation, rather than direct interrogation, with Marcus serving as both interviewer and psychological pressure point. Morrison's revelations were disturbing in their scope and sophistication. The terrorist cell had been recruiting former military personnel with specialized skills, creating a network of operatives with capabilities that exceeded anything federal agencies had previously encountered in domestic terrorism investigations. Their access to classified information suggested penetration of law enforcement and military organizations at levels that posed serious national security threats. Most concerning was Morrison's description of the planned attacks against children's targets. The operational planning was detailed and professional, with contingency procedures that reflected advanced tactical training and extensive reconnaissance. The attacks were designed to maximize psychological impact while challenging law enforcement response capabilities through simultaneous execution at multiple locations. As the interrogation progressed, Marcus found himself drawn into the investigation in ways that extended far beyond his original role as a tactical consultant. Morrison's respect for his abilities had created opportunities for information gathering that federal agents couldn't achieve through conventional methods. The psychological dynamic between captor and captured was complex and personally challenging for Marcus, who had to maintain professional detachment while dealing with someone whose plans would have resulted in the deaths of innocent children. The breakthrough came when Morrison began describing the specific intelligence sources that had provided his cell with classified information about law enforcement capabilities. The details he revealed identified a federal law enforcement officer who had been providing tactical information to terrorist networks for over a year, compromising operations and endangering personnel across multiple jurisdictions. Agent Valdez was monitoring the interrogation from an adjacent room, and her immediate response indicated the significance of Morrison's revelations. The identification of a federal insider who was supporting domestic terrorism represented a security breach with implications that extended far beyond the immediate terrorist threats they were investigating. Marcus continued the conversation for another hour, extracting additional details about the insider's methods and the specific information that had been compromised. Morrison's willingness to provide these details appeared to be motivated by his respect for Marcus's tactical abilities and his desire to demonstrate his own importance within the terrorist network. When the interrogation session concluded, Agent Valdez immediately initiated procedures for investigating and apprehending the identified federal insider. The intelligence Marcus had helped extract would prevent the planned attacks while exposing a security breach that had been undermining federal law enforcement operations for months. Thompson, Agent Valdez said as they reviewed the interrogation. Results: your participation in this operation has been invaluable. Morrison provided information that our traditional interrogation methods couldn't extract, and the intelligence we've gathered will save lives and protect national security. The successful completion of the interrogation represented a different kind of tactical victory than Marcus had achieved during the mall crisis. Instead of precision shooting and direct action, he had used psychological skills and tactical credibility to extract information that would prevent future terrorist attacks. The operation demonstrated capabilities that extended beyond his military training into areas of federal law enforcement that he had never previously considered. As Marcus prepared to return to his academy training and planned a career in civilian law enforcement, he understood that his involvement in federal operations had permanently altered his trajectory. The skills and experience that had made him valuable during these crises would inevitably lead to additional opportunities and responsibilities that extended far beyond typical police work. The transformation from academy student to federal consultant had been completed through a series of operations that tested every aspect of his training and capabilities. Marcus had proven himself not just as a precision marksman, but as an operator who could adapt his skills to serve law enforcement needs that were far more complex and significant than anything he had anticipated when he'd first arrived at the Riverside Police Academy, 6 months after the Morrison interrogation. Marcus Thompson stood at the podium of the FBI Academy's main auditorium, looking out at an audience of federal agents, military instructors, and law enforcement officials who had gathered for the annual Advanced Tactical Training Conference. The man who had once been dismissed as lucky shot by his police academy classmates was now being introduced as the keynote speaker for a symposium on precision marksmanship and tactical psychology. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Director Sarah Matthews of the FBI's Critical Incident Response Group, "I'm honored to introduce Special Consultant Marcus Thompson, whose innovative approaches to tactical operations have revolutionized how we think about crisis resolution and intelligence gathering." The transformation in Marcus's professional status had been as dramatic as it was unexpected. What had begun as a simple desire to serve his community as a police officer had evolved into a federal consulting role that utilized the full spectrum of his military training and experience. The careful anonymity he'd once sought had been replaced by recognition as one of the nation's leading experts in tactical operations and behavioral analysis. Marcus began his presentation with a detailed analysis of the Westfield Mall operation, using tactical diagrams and ballistic data to explain how precision shooting could be integrated with psychological operations to achieve optimal outcomes. His audience included some of the most experienced tactical operators in federal law enforcement, yet they listened with the focused attention of students learning revolutionary concepts. The key insight, Marcus explained, advancing to a slide, showing the exact placement of his shots during the crisis, was recognizing that neutralization doesn't always require elimination. By targeting the shooter's capabilities rather than his person, we created opportunities for intelligence gathering that wouldn't have existed if we'd followed conventional tactical doctrine. The presentation continued for 90 minutes, covering advanced topics in precision shooting, tactical psychology, and crisis negotiation that reflected Marcus's unique combination of military experience and federal law enforcement consulting. His analysis of the Morrison case had become required reading at multiple federal training facilities, establishing him as a thought leader in areas where tactical operations intersected with intelligence gathering. During the question and answer session that followed, Agent Patricia Valdez raised her hand with a smile that reflected both professional respect and personal appreciation for Marcus's contributions to federal operations. Marcus, your work on the Morrison case led to the prevention of 3 separate terrorist attacks and the identification of security breaches that had been compromising federal operations for over a year. How do you view the evolution of your role from police recruit to federal consultant? Marcus paused before responding, considering how to explain a transformation that had surprised him as much as anyone else. Agent Valdez, I think the key lesson is that expertise has value regardless of where it's applied. The same skills that made me effective as a military operator proved valuable in law enforcement contexts, but only when the circumstances allowed those capabilities to be recognized and utilized appropriately. The answer drew nods of understanding from an audience that included many former military personnel who had struggled with similar transitions to civilian careers. Marcus's experience had become a case study in how specialized skills could be transferred between military and law enforcement contexts when institutional barriers were overcome. After the conference concluded, Marcus found himself surrounded by federal agents and military instructors who wanted to discuss specific aspects of his tactical methodologies. The conversations were professional and respectful, a stark contrast to the dismissive skepticism he'd encountered during his early months at the police academy. His expertise was now sought after rather than questioned, creating opportunities for collaboration and knowledge sharing that enhanced both his own capabilities and those of the agencies he worked with. Detective Chen, who had been instrumental in recognizing Marcus's abilities during the mall crisis, approached with news about his former classmates at the Riverside Police Academy. Marcus, I thought you'd want to know that the Academy has completely restructured their advanced marksmanship program based on the training methodologies you developed. Tommy Sullivan is now one of the instructors, and he speaks about your influence on his understanding of precision shooting. The information was both gratifying and amusing to Marcus, who remembered Sullivan's confident challenges and theories about equipment advantages. The transformation in Sullivan's perspective reflected the broader changes that had occurred throughout the law enforcement community as Marcus's methods and insights gained recognition and adoption. Jennifer Rodriguez had also benefited from the Academy's restructured training program, earning promotion to the department's tactical unit based on improvements in her shooting performance that she credited to techniques Marcus had shared during their academy training. Her success represented the kind of knowledge transfer that Marcus found most satisfying, as it demonstrated how his expertise could multiply its impact through teaching and mentoring. Captain Rebecca Hayes had left the academy to accept a position with the FBI's Tactical Training Division, where she was implementing programs based on Marcus's integration of precision shooting with psychological operations. Her military background had enabled her to understand the significance of Marcus's innovations, and her federal position allowed her to disseminate those concepts throughout the law enforcement community. David Park had completed his academy training and joined the Riverside Police Department, but his analytical approach to performance evaluation had evolved to recognize factors beyond simple statistical measurements. His academic background had proven valuable for documenting and systematizing the training improvements that resulted from Marcus's methodologies, creating scholarly articles that enhanced the credibility and adoption of innovative tactical concepts. Marcus's relationship with Sarah Martinez had also evolved during his transformation from anonymous academy student to recognized federal consultant. Her initial concerns about his reluctance to discuss his military background had been resolved when his federal role required a level of transparency about his capabilities and experience. Their relationship had deepened as Sarah came to understand the significance of Marcus's contributions to national security and public safety. "I'm proud of what you've accomplished," Sarah had told him during a recent conversation about his expanding federal responsibilities. "You've found a way to serve your community and your country that utilizes everything you learned during your military career. That's exactly what you were looking for when you left the SEALs." The observation was accurate in ways that Marcus was still processing. His original goal of quiet service in civilian law enforcement had been replaced by high-profile consulting work that placed him at the forefront of tactical innovation and federal operations. The transformation had been driven by circumstances rather than ambition, but it had resulted in a career that provided both personal satisfaction and significant impact. Marcus's mother had recovered successfully from her cancer treatment, and she had become one of his most enthusiastic supporters as his federal consulting work gained national recognition. "I always knew you were special," she had said with maternal pride. "But I never imagined that your military training would lead to preventing terrorist attacks and saving children's lives." The federal consulting work had also provided Marcus with financial resources that enabled him to support his mother's medical expenses and establish a foundation that provided scholarships for military veterans transitioning to civilian careers. The foundation's work reflected his understanding of the challenges faced by former service members who possessed valuable skills but struggled to find appropriate applications in civilian contexts. Agent Valdez had become not just a professional colleague but a mentor who helped Marcus navigate the complex world of federal law enforcement consulting. Her experience and connections had been invaluable for establishing his credibility and ensuring that his innovations were adopted by agencies that could benefit from advanced tactical methodologies. "Marcus," Agent Valdez had explained during one of their strategic planning sessions, "your unique combination of tactical expertise and psychological insight represents capabilities that federal law enforcement desperately needs. The threats we're facing are evolving faster than our traditional training methods, and your approaches provide solutions that address current operational requirements." The validation was professionally satisfying, but Marcus remained focused on the practical applications of his work rather than personal recognition. His goal was to enhance the capabilities of law enforcement personnel who faced dangerous situations with inadequate preparation or resources. The techniques he developed were designed to save lives and improve operational outcomes, rather than advance his own career. The transformation had also provided Marcus with opportunities to work directly with military special operations units, sharing insights about how tactical skills could be adapted for civilian law enforcement contexts. The collaboration was mutually beneficial, as military operators gained understanding of legal and procedural constraints that affected civilian operations, while law enforcement personnel learned advanced techniques that enhanced their tactical capabilities. Marcus's work with the Morrison interrogation had established him as an expert in tactical psychology, leading to consulting opportunities with federal agencies that were developing new approaches to intelligence gathering and crisis negotiation. His understanding of how tactical credibility could be leveraged for psychological advantage had applications that extended far beyond traditional law enforcement scenarios. The annual marksmanship competition that had originally been scheduled as a demonstration of the Academy's most promising recruit had eventually taken place, but under very different circumstances. Marcus had participated as a guest instructor rather than a student, demonstrating advanced techniques while explaining the theoretical principles that made precision shooting effective in tactical operations. His performance during the demonstration had been flawless, with 47 consecutive perfect shots at distances ranging from 100 to 800 meters, using different weapons and varying environmental conditions. The exhibition had served as both a validation of his capabilities and an educational opportunity for law enforcement personnel who could benefit from understanding advanced marksmanship principles. Tommy Sullivan had been among the observers during the demonstration, and his reaction had reflected the complete transformation in his understanding of Marcus's abilities. "I owe you an apology," Sullivan had said afterward. "I spent months trying to prove that your shooting was luck or equipment advantages, when I should have been trying to learn from someone whose skills exceeded anything I'd ever encountered." The apology had been gracious and sincere, but Marcus had dismissed it as unnecessary. "Tommy, skepticism is healthy in tactical training. Your questions and challenges made me a better instructor because they forced me to think about how to explain concepts that had become automatic. That's valuable feedback that improved my teaching methods." As Marcus concluded his keynote presentation and prepared for the reception that would follow, he reflected on the journey that had transformed him from a SEAL seeking anonymity into a federal consultant whose expertise was recognized nationally. The path had been unexpected and sometimes challenging, but it had resulted in a career that utilized his full range of capabilities while serving purposes that aligned with his values and objectives. The man who had once been called Lucky Shot by dismissive classmates was now recognized as one of the nation's leading experts in tactical operations and precision marksmanship. The transformation had been earned through demonstrated competence under the most demanding circumstances, proving that excellence could not be hidden indefinitely when circumstances demanded its revelation. 3 years later, Marcus found himself standing in the Rose Garden of the White House, accepting the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his contributions to national security and law enforcement innovation. President Harrison's citation, read aloud during the ceremony, highlighted not just his tactical achievements, but his role in fundamentally changing how America's law enforcement agencies approached crisis resolution and intelligence gathering. Marcus Thompson represents the finest traditions of American service, the president declared to the assembled crowd of dignitaries, military leaders, and law enforcement officials. His transition from military service to civilian law enforcement has enhanced our nation's security while demonstrating the invaluable contributions that veterans can make in protecting our communities. The ceremony was attended by many of the people who had witnessed Marcus's journey from dismissed academy student to national security asset. Detective Chun sat in the front row, tears visible in her eyes as she watched the recognition of capabilities she had been among the first to recognize. Captain Hayes, now Deputy Director of the FBI's Critical Incident Response Group, beamed with pride at seeing her former Academy colleague receive the nation's highest civilian honor. Even Tommy Sullivan was present, wearing his dress uniform, as a newly promoted sergeant in the Riverside Police Department's tactical unit. His journey from skeptical classmate to devoted student of Marcus's methodologies had become a case study in how professional relationships could evolve when expertise was finally recognized and respected. The president's remarks continued, detailing specific operations where Marcus's innovations had prevented terrorist attacks, resolved hostage situations, and saved countless lives across multiple states. The techniques developed by consultant Thompson are now standard training protocols for federal agencies, military special operations units, and law enforcement departments nationwide, creating a legacy of enhanced public safety that will benefit our nation for generations. Following the White House ceremony, Marcus returned to the expanded training facility that bore his name, the Thompson Center for Advanced Tactical Studies, located on a 200-acre campus in Virginia that served federal agencies, military units, and select law enforcement departments. The facility represented the institutionalization of training methodologies that had emerged from Marcus's unique combination of military expertise and civilian law enforcement experience. The center's main building housed state-of-the-art simulation facilities, precision rifle ranges, and classroom spaces where instructors taught integrated programs combining marksmanship, tactical psychology, and crisis resolution. Students included FBI hostage rescue teams, military special operations personnel, and carefully selected law enforcement officers who demonstrated the aptitude and dedication required for advanced tactical training. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the center's academic director and a former military psychologist, had worked closely with Marcus to develop a curriculum that reflected his holistic approach to tactical operations. Marcus's genius, she often explained to visiting officials, lies in understanding that modern tactical challenges require integration of physical skills, psychological insight, and strategic thinking. His programs produce operators who can adapt to complex situations rather than simply executing predetermined responses. The center's research division had become a leading source of innovation in tactical equipment and training methodologies. Marcus's collaboration with defense contractors had resulted in advanced optic systems, ballistic computers, and simulation technologies that enhanced training effectiveness while reducing costs. His understanding of operational requirements from both military and civilian perspectives enabled him to bridge the gap between theoretical research and practical application. International delegations regularly visited the center to study American approaches to tactical training and crisis resolution. Marcus had briefed representatives from allied nations, including the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and Germany, sharing methodologies that enhanced global counterterrorism capabilities while strengthening diplomatic relationships through professional cooperation. The ripple effects of Marcus's transformation extended far beyond official recognition and institutional changes. Sarah Martinez had become Dr. Sarah Thompson following their marriage 2 years earlier, and she now served as the center's chief medical officer, developing trauma care protocols and psychological support programs for tactical operators. Her nursing background and intimate understanding of Marcus's experiences had proven invaluable for creating comprehensive health and wellness programs. Their first child, Michael, had been born 8 months earlier, carrying the name of Marcus's SEL teammate who had died during the classified operation that had prompted Marcus's transition to civilian service. The birth had added new dimensions to Marcus's understanding of purpose and legacy, motivating him to ensure that his professional contributions would create a safer world for the next generation. Marcus's mother had become a regular fixture at center events, serving as an unofficial grandmother figure to the children of staff members and visiting personnel. Her pride in Marcus's achievements was evident to everyone who met her, but she was equally proud of his character and his commitment to using his abilities in service of others rather than personal advancement. The foundation Marcus had established for veteran transitions had expanded beyond scholarships to include job placement programs, mental health support services, and entrepreneurship assistance for former military personnel seeking civilian careers. The foundation's success rate in helping veterans find meaningful, Employment had attracted attention from congressional committees and veteran advocacy organizations seeking to replicate successful transition programs that Jennifer Rodriguez had completed advanced training at the Thompson Center and was now serving as a senior instructor, specializing in precision rifle techniques for female law enforcement officers. Her programs addressed both technical training requirements and the unique challenges faced by women in tactical law enforcement roles. Her success had inspired similar programs at other training facilities, expanding opportunities for qualified female officers throughout the country. David Park had pursued graduate studies in tactical psychology, earning a doctorate with a dissertation analyzing the statistical patterns that had initially made him suspicious of Marcus's academy performance. His research had evolved into predictive models that helped identify individuals with exceptional tactical potential, enabling training programs to optimize resource allocation and maximize student success rates. The annual reunion of Marcus's academy class had become a significant event at the center, drawing law enforcement officers from across the country who wanted to reconnect with classmates and observe the latest developments in tactical training. The reunion served as informal professional development conferences where experienced officers could learn new techniques while sharing insights from their operational experiences. During the most recent reunion, Chief Inspector Williams had publicly apologized to Marcus for failing to recognize his capabilities during academy training. "I let institutional biases prevent me from seeing what was obvious to anyone who looked beyond surface assumptions," Williams had admitted to the assembled group. "Marcus's experience taught me that excellence can come from unexpected sources, and that recognizing talent requires looking beyond conventional credentials." The apology had been gracious but unnecessary from Marcus's perspective. He understood that institutional limitations and human biases were natural obstacles that exceptional individuals often had to overcome. His focus remained on ensuring that current and future training programs would be better equipped to identify and develop talent, regardless of its source or initial presentation. Marcus's speaking engagements had expanded to include universities, corporate leadership programs, and international conferences on security and leadership. His insights about performance under pressure, team dynamics, and achieving excellence despite institutional obstacles resonated with audiences far beyond law enforcement and military communities. His autobiography, Beyond Lucky Shots, A Journey from Concealment to Excellence, had become a bestseller and required reading in leadership programs across multiple industries. The book detailed not just his tactical experiences, but the psychological and professional challenges of transitioning between careers while maintaining personal integrity and professional standards. The Thompson Center had also become a research hub for studying post-traumatic stress, tactical decision-making, and the psychological factors that enabled some individuals to perform exceptionally under extreme pressure. Marcus's willingness to participate in studies about his own experiences had contributed to breakthroughs in understanding how military training could be adapted for civilian applications. As Marcus stood in his office overlooking the center's main training range, watching instructors work with students who would become the next generation of tactical professionals, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from anonymous academy student to national security asset. The transformation had required him to abandon his desire for anonymity, but it had enabled him to serve his country and community in ways that exceeded anything he had accomplished during his military career. The sound of precision rifle fire from the range below reminded him of the afternoon when he had finally revealed his true capabilities to a skeptical audience at the Riverside Police Academy. That moment of decision had set in motion a series of events that transformed not just his own career, but the entire approach to tactical training and crisis resolution across American law enforcement. Marcus Thompson had found his place in civilian service, but on terms that honored rather than concealed the skills and experience that defined his professional identity. The journey from anonymity to recognition had been completed, establishing him as a bridge between military expertise and civilian law enforcement needs in ways that enhanced both communities while serving the broader interests of national security and public safety. The legacy he was building would extend far beyond his own career, influencing how future generations of tactical professionals would be trained, recognized, and utilized in service of their communities and their nation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.